If you've ever had a project car, you know there are times when you'll spend hours or days in the garage and feel like you've accomplished nothing. One thing leads to two extra things, leads to four unforeseen things, and a week later your to-do list is longer than when you started. It's like really terrible time travel. Today we're going to install the airbox in the Viper. This part right up here. It's just a plastic airbox with a filter inside. I took it out to get the upper suspension mounts installed and it needs to go back in. That's all we're doing. Just the airbox, and a few things we need to do to get the airbox in. And I know some of you have been watching this channel for a while and you're saying, yeah right Matt, you're going to go off on some 15-minute tangent where you buy a drum set or join the circus or overthrow Bolivia, but no, we are only going to install the airbox. It took me a week. I originally removed the airbox because I designed my upper control arms to be mounted to the frame slightly inside the engine bay below the airbox and slightly inside this cross brace. So to get the airbox in, we first need to slightly modify the cross brace and install it. But in marking out the cuts for the cross brace, I realized I can't actually remove the upper front control arm mount without removing the cross brace, and I'm going to need to do that when I get an alignment done. I need to be able to remove it to change the camber, but I can actually measure the camber now, adjust it, and then bolt this top part in and be done with it. And yes, I could skip this, but if I know I'm going to have to remove the cross brace and airbox later, then I'm not really installing the airbox. The goal is to do this and be done with it. So I checked the camber, and it was pretty bad. It was almost a full degree out on the left and more than one on the right. Fortunately, the camber can be easily changed by threading the rod ends into the control arms. Knowing the thread pitch of the rod ends and the dimensions of the suspension arms, I did some quick math and realized I would need to screw the rod ends in on the left 4.4 times and on the right 6.2 times. But since they need to be oriented a certain way, I had to round them to the nearest half turn. Simple enough. Unfortunately, when I thread them in that far, the control arms themselves clash with the frame of the car. So to thread the rod ends in that far, I would need to remove almost ½ an inch from the control arms. My initial plan was to use a mill and cut off an exact amount so I could know exactly how many threads need to be visible based on how many were visible when I measured the camber, but I got lazy and just used a bandsaw. It's probably fine. Besides, we don't have all day here, we're just installing an airbox. The arms cut fine, but remember those clampy things I added to the upper control arms? I don't have room for a jam nut, so to keep the threads from bouncing around, I cut a slot in the side of the threads and welded some steel with drilled holes to clamp it down. The clamps! But now, with the tips cut off, part of my clamp holes are gone. I don't really want to rely on just one small bolt, I'd rather have two. I tried drilling another hole closer and squeezing the two bolts together, but there's just not enough room. I considered remaking the upper control arms entirely. They were a pretty easy send cut send weld job. I'm not really sure why I needed to adjust them in so much. One of these days I'm going to 3D scan the suspension as built and compare it with the CAD to see where I'm off. But not today. Today I decided to just cut off the clampy parts and weld on new ones. I chopped the old ones off, cut up some 1/2 inch square extruded steel, welded them on, and drilled and tapped them. I gave them a coat of spray paint and screwed in the rod ends, adjusted them to roughly the correct number of threads showing based on my previous calculations, and I installed them. The left went in no problem. Small problem, actually. I had to cut away some of the wheel liner to get the wrench on the bolt. Not a big deal. On the other side, however, there was a bigger problem. See, I made these brackets to mount the external reservoirs on the shocks. I had Send Cut Send laser them out, and then I bent them on my bench vise. If you're ever wondering why I love Send Cut Send so much, for 5 minutes of design time, I got a part that worked better for me and a better material for a fraction of the cost. Fox wanted $160 for 4 of these. For that, Send Cut Send would have shipped me 40. By the way, if for some insane reason you haven't ordered from Send Cut Send yet, you can get 15% off using the link in the description. Most of the modifications on this car have used parts from them. Anyway, the left side tucked neatly in the back, but the right side had some issues. The coolant reservoir is in the exact wrong place on the right side, so I had to flip the reservoir around to the front. I did this with the control arms removed and found out when installing them back in that both the control arm and reservoir are trying to occupy the same space at the same time, which is illegal. So I had to remove the reservoir, remove the clamp, rotate it, add a new rivet nut, and also modify more of the wheel liner to get the hose to fit. I also needed to rotate the reservoir around the hose, which meant I needed to bleed out the nitrogen pressure. I'll have to get these pressurized again, which I will probably forget to do. Somebody remind me in a few weeks. It was 100 degrees in the garage. This took way longer than it should have, and after all of that, the steering won't go back together. If you remember last time, or maybe the time before that, I couldn't get the steering to attach to the uprights because Dodge did not foresee me adding a foot of travel to their suspension, so therefore they did not give me enough articulation in their steering rack. Weirdly, it's just barely not enough. I can actually fix this by moving the mount up about 4 millimeters, but to do that, I'll need to remake the entire steering arm assembly thing that bolts to the upright. I did make this a separate piece, just in case, but there might be an easier way to do this. We don't need to be remaking suspension parts just to install an airbox. We can drop the whole steering rack about 6 millimeters, which would give us plenty of room, so let's just do that. The steering is normally held in place with a couple of bushings, but the previous owner of this car replaced those rubber bushings with aluminum to give a more direct steering feel. Fine with me, and I can just redesign to make a new aluminum bushing that gets rid of the ledge on the bottom. So I did, and since the small rubber piece was barely there, I made new ones and installed everything onto the car. This was actually a total pain. It took several hours. It would have been difficult on its own without the fact that I welded a bunch of steel in the way. I designed the suspension to have no bump steer, and moving the steering rack might change that slightly. It certainly does in CAD, but I'm just going to do it and check in the real world to see, since it's only a little bit and since I know my CAD is slightly off anyway. When I took the old bushings out, there were a couple of spacers under the rack on the right side. I assume these were there to compensate for some misalignment in the steering rack. The Viper was not so much a factory production car as it was a kit car made in a factory, so stuff doesn't necessarily line up. So I added the spacers, actually just the thick one, back in where it came from, but that made it not work. The left side, the side without the spacer, worked great, but the right side was still too high. So I ditched the spacer and it all lined up just fine. Hopefully I don't need the spacer for some unknown reason. But everything else looks good. With the lowered rack, the inner ball joint now articulates enough to get to the steering mount. Unfortunately, now the outer side doesn't want to articulate enough. I originally designed this with these McMaster high misalignment rod ends, probably made by FK Bearings or something, but then I decided to go with Aurora rod ends because I like tight steering and Aurora makes great rod ends. Unfortunately, I got the wrong high misalignment spacers twice. I talked about this before. I ended up modifying a couple of sets of stainless spacers, and with the rack now working, I needed to modify them a little bit to get more misalignment out of them. Anyway, that took some time, but we are done with the steering. While I was up here, I started to really question the brakes situation. The brakes on the early Vipers are god-awful, and while it'll probably be fine, I did take some time to search around and find some replacement brakes. Then I catted them up, and then I catted up a mounting bracket, but I didn't go any further because we are here to install an airbox, not brakes. That comes later. Stay focused, Matt. However, there are a couple of things we need to do on the rear end first. I know the rear end is pretty far from the airbox, but I need to double check the alignment, and to do that I need it on the ground, and I have the rear end propped up because I don't have the panhard bar installed. I don't have the panhard installed because I messed up on the laser cutting for the body side mount. These holes are supposed to be 5/8 of an inch, but they are 3/4 of an inch. The spacers I got for the rod ends have an inside diameter of 5/8, so I designed some parts to weld on and bring these holes down to 5/8, and then I thought that's actually not a great idea. This is going to leave a step in the clamp, which will reduce the clamping area, and it's just kind of lazy. The correct way to do this is to just get different spacers. I can get ones that have a 3/4 inch ID and just use a 3/4 inch bolt. Although I could use the spacers I have. I could chuck them up in the lathe and increase the inside diameter from 5/8 to 3/4, but they are zinc coated, they're not stainless, and the inside would lose that coating if I cut it anyway. And besides, it's just easier to buy new ones. Annoyingly, they are sold individually, even though you always need 2 of them. Fine. But more annoyingly, after tax and shipping, these $10 parts cost almost $37. So I just drilled out the ones I had. But there was a problem with that too. See where it necks down here? This is pretty small. Smaller, in fact, than the 3/4 of an inch I was trying to make the inside, and they just became 2 pieces on the lathe. Should have seen that one coming. So I just bought the spacers, but I got them from McMaster instead so I could get them next day, and also since I needed a new bolt anyway. Unfortunately, when they arrived, they didn't look much like the picture and were too long. But they are stainless, so I just chucked them up in the lathe and cut them down to size. I know some of you machinists are saying that this is not the correct cutter to be using for this, but you're forgetting that the correct cutter is always the one that was already in the lathe when you got there. With that finished, I decided I should probably paint this part of the frame so that it will stop rusting. I got some self-etching primer because I like to do things the correct way. But I didn't mask off anything else because I only like to do things the correct way when they're easy. With the metal self-etched and primed, I painted the rest of my panhard mount. There are a lot of nooks and crannies in there, so I had to bust out the brush-on paint and make an absolute mess of everything. I also painted the panhard bar since it was out and since I'd like to install it for the last time this time. Then I shoved it in there, bolted it in, and we can get back to the airbox. With the rear on the ground, it was time to install the front wheels. Unfortunately, I initially bought these crappy wheel nuts. I didn't think you could screw up wheel nuts this badly, but the threads are not concentric with the hex on the outside, so the socket rubs on the wheel when you try to use them. I bought some replacements and installed the wheel. Now, time to check the camber. I'm doing this by just holding an inanimate aluminum rod against the wheel. It's not the most accurate, but it should be close enough. Although we did just spend all that time just to get the rear end on the ground. So we could design a custom laser alignment machine using only send, cut, send and an Arduino. You know what, let's not do that. Let's just use the rod. 90 degrees, perfectly vertical. I actually wanted a little bit of negative camber, but this is close enough. We have spent too much time on this. We're just trying to install an airbox. And we will right after we get this cross brace installed. For real this time. It's going in. To do that, I need to cut away some of the brace to clear the upper control arm mounts I added. I marked out the area that needed to be cut and hit it with a Sawzall. You probably noticed this nub here. That was a bar going down at an angle to the lower frame. I couldn't get the brace out with that attached without disassembling half of the front of the car, so it met the Sawzall, and it's not going back in. It took me well over an hour just to get the cross brace in place. I think welding on the new upper control arm mounts made everything move around a little bit, so I had to pry and wedge and hammer it in there and then tap it and pry it in place. If I have to remove this cross brace in the future, I'm just going to cut it in half and figure out a better solution. But hopefully I don't have to do that. That was the whole point of all of this, actually getting things done. And it's done. It's in. It's bolted in. And now is the time to fix these rivet nuts. They pulled out when I was messing with the cross brace. Don't buy cheap rivet nuts. You'd think they'd all be the same, but somehow someone managed to make rivet nuts that don't stay riveted. Anyway, with that done, we can finally, after all this time, install the airbox. A quick slide into place. I'm missing a hose clamp, but found it with a quick look around the garage. Tighten those down, screw down the front, attach this hose over here, plug in the intake temperature sensor or whatever this thing is, and we are done. Done with the simplest possible one-part install. The airbox is installed. And for all of you out there wondering if this is going to be done in time for SEMA, the answer is no. It really did take me an entire week just to get an airbox installed. For those of you wondering why this car is taking so long, just go back and watch this video about 45 times because this kind of thing happens all the time with every little stupid thing. Still beats having a real job, though. It used to be that you had to impress people to get people to watch your show. Now you just have to impress the algorithm. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. All hail the algorithm.